Hello, everyone. Welcome to our 19th session of a series of webinars entitled New War and Peace, organized by the editorial board of the Caucasus edition. Today, we're going to have a very important discussion introducing decolonization or decolonial thinking to the South Caucasus, which will be based on the article recently published on the website of the Caucasus edition, as well as a printed version of the Caucasus Edition journal. The article is entitled Imperial Legacies in the South Caucasus, Armenian-Azerbaijani Relations from 1918 to 1920. Today, I have a pleasure to have with us the authors of this article, Diana Yayloyan, who is a PhD candidate in international relations in the Middle East Technical University, and who is also the co-founder of the platform Caucasus Talks, and Lala Darchinova, who works for the Feminist Peace Collective and Imagine Center for Conflict Transformation. Hello.
Hi, Vadim. Thank you for introduction.
Thank you, Vadim.
Thanks for joining. Thanks for coming, and thanks for your article, which is very interesting and fascinating and very important for these discussions in the region. And so my first question then, why do we need decolonial discussions in the South Caucasus? Why do we need these decolonial lenses for the region? And do you feel that there is any lack of these kind of discussions?
Anna, do you want to go first, or maybe?
Yeah, you can start.
Okay, so I'll try to be brief. I think there is a lack of these discussions. There are a lot of research about the imperial characteristics, or how Russia was the empire. And of course, there is also additional research on the Ottomans and as an empire. But from a Caucasus perspective, how it's researched, what is the perspective of the people from the Caucasus, I think it lacks. There are the research emerging in the Central Asia right now on this decolonial perspective, from the perspective of the people living in Central Asia and Caucasus. But I think this is something to explore more. There are research of Madina Tolstanova. I think she's one of the best known in this sphere on the colonial analysis of Russia and Caucasus. But still, I think we need to talk to each other and from our own voice about the knowledge that we have in the region, about the structures, how we see the structures, about the dynamics. And this is something that we seriously lack. Over to you, Diana.
So to add to what Lala already said, one also of the reasons why we wanted so much to understand how we can also rethink the ongoing political, economic, cultural relations, and also the production of the knowledge in the South Caucasus and also larger post-Soviet space by using the decolonial theory is exactly the important argument that the colonialists are claiming, that the end of the legal forms of control and of the ex-colonial power does not yet mean the end of the other forms of control. And for example, discursive colonization is one of the important and interesting aspects, the production of knowledge in the post-Soviet space, for example. How do we decolonize this knowledge? What do we understand under the decolonization? And when we were doing the literature review with Lala, we realized that most of the literature is produced in Latin America, in India, in Africa, in East Asia. But there is a lot of questions that we have, but almost no information, no scholarship producing on how we can think that not just post-Soviet experience, but also pre-Soviet experience. And I think this period is especially lacking. And another interesting thing is what we found is that the colonial approach is also very helpful in understanding not just relations between the ex-colonized and former colonial power, but also to reveal and to bring to the surface the forgotten narratives in local communities, not between just one nation, but but also inside of the nation between different communities. And I think this is one of the important contributions of decolonial theory, although it should be also not taken for granted. Today, we see there are a lot of discussions in decolonization, and different scholars have very different understanding of what do they mean by decolonization. It can be also sometimes abused, and we want to be very careful about this. And I very much hope that this will be just a preliminary stage, because we also have as much questions after writing the article as we had before writing the article. And I hope that this will be leading to new discussions with a much larger audience, not just from the South Caucasus, but also from the surrounding regions.
Just to add very briefly, sometimes I very much agree with Diana, but sometimes we live in the structures and we don't see the violence explicitly. It's implicitly there, especially the knowledge-based violence. We are living in these social relations, and we don't even realize that sometimes they are the legacies of the empires or the colonial thinking. Not always, of course, it's a bad thing, but sometimes it's a implicit, let's say, things that we never questioned and never tried to understood from our own perspective. That's why I think that the colonial lens adds this analysis, or as the opportunities to see these things from a different gaze.
Thank you, Diana. Thank you, Lala. Yes, that's a very important point, actually. Like, there's different perspectives on decolonization and different approaches to this concept. And I think we will maybe cover the discussions rather in the end of today's session. But let's discuss first your article. So why you decided to focus on this period, 1918-1920? Why this period is important for the region from the perspective of decolonization? Because of some maybe historical events or political formations of that time. That's very interesting to hear.
I can start, though, if you want, and you can join. So when we were thinking with Lala how to approach the region, we, after doing also some literature review, we realized that also one of the important things of the colonial approach is that it is talking about the importance of understanding the rupture and continuation through the structural change. Structural change cannot, so structure cannot just change within 1 or 2 generations. It is a much more complicated structure, is much more complicated because it sometimes certain impact and continuations might be obscured by the discourse. Like this happened, for example, with Western European colonial powers that would be representing themselves in 1920s as a cradle of enlightenment, of civilization and progress, leading the civilizing mission. And for example, if you think about the mandate system, I think this is a very interesting example to think the relations of Armenia-Azerbaijan in 1980s in parallel with the ongoing mandate system that was happening in 1920s, is the way that not only relations of Armenia and Azerbaijan were constructed with Russian Empire and Ottoman Empire and later Kemalist Turkey, but also with Western European countries. For example, the British Empire had interest in the South Caucasus, but this is basically being today either not so much researched, and British Empire has been today not so much in the spotlight in comparison with Russia. And another important reason is that we were trying to understand how in the 2 years of obtainance of sovereignty by Armenia and Azerbaijan for the first time in history, becoming the independent nation states, how this rupture from the former imperial power of Russian Empire was affecting the local actors, how they tried to find solution to the land dispute that Armenia and Azerbaijan were having, to the economic issues, they were having territorial also issues. So because there is so much, discussion saying that if not the empires, we would be living in the peace. If not the empires, we would not having the fights. But we were basically trying to understand how in that time political leaders were making sense of this short independence that they just obtained from the imperial powers, and whether they could overcome the conflicts, whether they could realize their own agency, or they just continued by debunking flanking one hegemony, they just continued basically the same nationalist thinking. That was one of the reasons why we wanted to go back a century ago to understand the structural changes.
Yeah, thank you. And not to repeat, but to add, I think this period of 1980 and 20, it's the time when the empires were collapsing, and when, especially in our region, empires like Russia and Ottoman, and it was the end of World War I. And this is the period when the world that we see right now as it is was actually starting to form in the form of nation states. So it was important for our analysis as well to go back when the nation states of Armenia and Azerbaijan started to emerge, and what kind of dynamics, especially imperial dynamics, were in the region. And we personally, we found and felt a lot of similarities from that period with our days today. And in many cases, we can even say that not much actually changed in terms of discourse and in terms of the same dynamics. So this period was very important to first analyze the emergence of the nation states and our own nation state, and what kind of, how the hegemonic powers in the region were affecting this emergence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Indeed, so this is the period, as I understand, right, where the states were like nation states in the region were formed, and I mean, and they are somehow all like the implications of that period is very relevant for the contemporary nation states in the region. Indeed, so but there have been at that time there were many different political groups, so especially political figures who were promoting the formation of the nation state of Armenia and Azerbaijan. But among these different groups and political figures, in your article, you decided to focus on two. For Azerbaijan, it was Rasulzadeh, and for Armenia, Kajaznuni. Why exactly these two figures? Why not someone else? Why their discourses were the most important and triggering for you?
Well, in our case, in case of Azerbaijan, at least, Rasulzadeh is one of the figures, political figures that are accepted by the nationalist groups, and yeah, mainly by the nationalists as a main political figure, and not just nationalist, but I would say like nationwide by ordinary people as the founding father of the state. And in many cases, his figure is heavily misinterpreted by the nationalists. And especially, I personally was interested in his views in relation to Armenia, Armenians, and the Caucasian confederation. And one of the goals for me personally was to kind of demystify his figure and to show how the discourse is manipulated or misinterpreted. He's certainly nationalist, and I am it's a disclaimer to say that not sharing or siding with his views, but just trying to show that when the nationalist group in Azerbaijan tried to manifest ethno-nationalist rhetoric and attach it to Rasulzadeh, in many cases they are just misinterpreting and misusing it, because mainly his views toward Armenians and relations with the Armenian state and the Caucasian confederation, it was calling for peace. He was calling for peace and having a confederative state, and with Armenia and Georgia, and he was seeing the cause of the problems or enmity between Armenians and Azerbaijanis in Russian Empire. Whether he was decolonial or not, it's another question. I think we will discuss it a bit later. He was particularly anti-Russian, but not, I would say, not really anti-imperialist, or selectively was anti-imperialist in terms of Russia, while he was very much in favor of Ottomans and Ottoman Empire and having friendly relations with them. But still, I think his views on his views on on nationalism, on ethno-nationalism, are seriously misinterpreted and misused. And I was trying in my part to show that moments of his thoughts regarding the Armenians and confederation and Caucasus relations in the Caucasus.
As for Hovhannes Kajaznani, I think he's a really very interesting thinker. And in comparison with Rasulzadeh, who is very much, let's say, appropriated also today in Azerbaijan, Hovhannes Kajaznani is almost neglected. Although he was one of the founding fathers of the First Republic of Armenia, he was a leading member of the Transcaucasus party, and he was the Prime Minister of the First Republic of Armenia. Because of his critical texts and critical speeches that he would have in the 1923-1924, and he would be splitting with from Transcaucasus party, and he would be coming back to Soviet Union in comparison with most of the members of Transcaucasus who self-exile and continue the struggle from abroad and do not accept the Soviet leadership. So Kajaznani, because he's accepting and he's saying that there is no other choice but to ally with Russia. There has been a serious intra-party dispute, and also interestingly that because of his critical text that he would be writing in the 1923-1924, some nationalists, especially Turkish nationalists, would be appropriating and taking this text, presenting them as if this was all that Kajaznani was saying. In the last years of his political activity, he would be very much criticizing Transcaucasus, saying that we had illusionary hopes with the West, we had illusionary hopes with Russia, etc. But it's important to understand that his ideas are they're constantly changing in terms of what he thinks, how Armenians should communicate and cooperate with Russia, with Turkey. So it's very much, let's say, appropriate taking Kajaznani's just later critiques, but dismissing his earlier texts and early activities where he was very much critical of both Russia and also Bolsheviks, and seeing Bolsheviks as basically just a continuation of the same imperialist politics that Russian Empire was having. Most importantly for me, the interest in Kajaznani's text is that he is basically the debates that he was having with members of Transcaucasus party in the First Republic of Armenia. It's so interesting and fascinating to see the parallels with today, especially the debates that Armenian nation was having as what they should do with the Ottoman Empire, with Kemalist Turkey, how they should consider the alliance with Russia, or whether Bolsheviks are still imperial power, or whether they changed as they claim by using the decolonial discourse. So understanding all this emotional burden that was on the shoulders of the First Republic's political figures, and especially Kajaznani, he has written a number of texts. So anyone who wants to understand the debates of that period, most of the texts are still in Armenian language, but slowly they are being translated. So I think this is a very valuable contribution. And although we focused on those two figures, but while doing this reading of the text with Lala, we found actually, and we started thinking about this, why is this the case? We didn't think about 1918-1920 relations from the perspective, for example, of Armenian and Azerbaijani socialists or anarchists. We constantly have this text, and we have this understanding of the past from the leading political figures, which were nationalist figures, but there is almost a missing perspective. For example, what do the socialists and anarchists in Transcaucasus were offering as a solution for land disputes, or for confederation, or for the nation state? So I very much hope that this will be revealed like with new research in future, because I believe that these ideological struggles happening inside of the societies are not less important as understanding the struggles between the nation state and the empires. Basically, this is also emphasizing the agencies of different political parties that were taking and operating in that time in Transcaucasus. And I think this is a very valuable research that hopefully will be done in future.
Thank you, Diana. Thank you, Lala. And indeed, it's very interesting how, like, eventually, discussions from decolonization led us to thinking about nationalism and those relations between nationalism and decolonization. And at the same time, you mentioned, Diana, that there can be, and there were different perspectives also already at that time, of course, from socialist camps and political groups, anarchist groups on decolonization, or maybe it was not, of course, in that much in the dictionary vocabulary of those groups, like the term decolonization, but anti-imperialism, for example, definitely was there. But thinking now about the contemporary period, so yes, we can agree, and we do agree that decolonization is something which we probably in the region, in not only in the South Caucasus, but in other parts of this globe, which remains very much colonized by the hegemons. We need to adhere to decolonialism somehow. But at the same time, there is this real threat to end up in nationalism. And then which may lead to other type of conflicts, ethno-nationalist and other types of conflicts. So how we can avoid this? We can avoid this problem? How to adhere to decolonization, to decolonialism, and not end up in nationalist thinking?
Okay, this is very important, I think, this discussion to distinguish between nationalist and the colonial discourse. I think we need to introduce something like anti-colonial or anti-imperialism and distinguish it from the colonialism. Because in my opinion, if we are doing the colonial research and the colonial activism, it's not compatible with the nationalist rhetoric. It emerges in Latin America, and it also backs up some kind of state form, but I don't think it ends up in a nationalism as anti-colonial or anti-colonial or anti-imperial movements, because as we saw from the history, many anti-colonial movements they ended up backing the state and nation, and eventually the new established states and nations continued the same form of the violence against the people. So we just changed one hegemon or one perpetrator with another one. Now the perpetrator is more nationalist, it's not distant other, but someone from the nation, from the same community, but still the violence and oppression of people continues. While if we will try to think in the colonial terms, we should also be able to deconstruct this logic of violence and oppression, and how and how it actually continues, even if there was a rupture from the empire and independent state, but still this state continues to show or to do the same kind of violence. So being anti-colonial, anti-imperial is not always enough. And that's why I think with Diana we chose more the colonial approach rather than just critiquing empires or colonialism and then adhering to nationalistic discourse.
And to add to what Lala said, I absolutely agree. And also another important thing is that even today, you can see how some leaders of authoritarian countries, and I would bring example of Turkey and Russia, are using the post-colonial critique combined with the nationalist rhetoric to justify their own, let's say, occupation and justify their own, as they call, struggle against the Western hegemony. And this is a very dangerous pattern. This needs to be very well understood. And there are already very valuable research. For example, we used it in our also article with Lala by Zarakolu and Çapan, the Turkish scholars who are analyzing the discourse of the leading party of Erdogan and showing how actually he is using very very successful with this post-colonial critique in order to justify his violation of international law, to justify his certain occupational policies. And the same is happening in Russia. We see not just the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, is using this also, but also there are different nationalist groups, right-wing groups. For example, Eurasianists are like Alexander Dugin is one of the interesting examples. So he's also using this critique of Western hegemony in a very like underpinning this with philosophical traditions. And this is basically just a right-wing rhetoric and instrumentalizing the post-colonial critique. And I think this is very important to understand, because we are now dealing with the rising influence of also Turkey in the South Caucasus, and we are now dealing with the legacies, and we are now dealing also with the continuous violence coming from the Russian Federation. So those are one of the important things that helping us to understand why decolonization is never meaning nationalism. And another important thing is that we should understand that decolonization is its elimination of the structural reasons of oppression is violence. And as Lala said, by getting rid of one hegemon does not yet mean that we decolonized. And that's why in the very beginning, I was saying we need to understand what do we mean under decolonization, and what do we replace, and what is the next step after the decolonization. Because not only decolonization should be understood as relations in interstate relations, it should be also understood how the government, the nation state, is treating its own population, its different ethnic groups, religious group inside of its country, how the intersubjective relations with own population are reproducing the same conditional coloniality, or they are more democratic and taking into the consideration the local voices. So that's why the colonial criticism is very much valuable to understand and differentiate between the nationalist thinking.
Just a very small remark. Diana mentioned these authoritarian leaders, and Ali very often uses the colonial rhetoric and being the part of non-alignment movement, and how, or in terms of, for example, France and the genocide in Algeria, he's also using the same anti-imperial discourse, but at the same time simultaneously talking about the greater Azerbaijan and employing the same kind of imperial discourse, like, for example, Russia does with protecting the rights of Russians outside of Russia. He's starting to use the same kind of rhetoric, trying to protect the rights of Azerbaijanis outside of Azerbaijan. So this is a discourse that can be very easily hijacked and manipulated by authoritarian leaders.
Yeah, very important point, and yeah, indeed, that's misusage or even misinterpretation by the authoritarian leaders, nationalist groups, of the concept of decolonialism and decolonization in general is very dangerous, to be honest, and that happens in different and that actually even historically it has been studied critically, approached critically by many post-colonial thinkers like Frantz Fanon, that there is a danger when after the kind of national liberation or decolonization based on national liberation eventually end up in tribalization and the fights between small local groups without really deconstructing the colonial structure of the societies. Yeah, so indeed that's very important discussion. But how do you see then how this can be, what civil society can do it to somehow how they can oppose this kind of misinterpretation of the concept discursively and maybe even in practice?
I think discursively we started to talk about it, but we need to organize more discussions around it, to do discursive interventions and publish more, and have more wider debates about decolonization and what is decolonization in the Caucasus. what alternatives we can offer. I personally think that Caucasus is part of European thinking, and this is not something that I am backing or aligning, but if we compare to Latin American, African, Asian indigenous people, when they, especially Latin American, when they speak about decolonization, they're bringing all their muted stories, all their oppressed stories or practices back into their social relations. But when I personally look at the Caucasus, Caucasus, I don't see any difference from the European kind of relations. I mean, the political relations, the same kind of state institution, the same kind of dynamics, the nation-state ideas, everything was pretty much similar to European thinking. So what would give decolonization in the Caucasus? This is itself a topic of discussion and understanding. So I think we should start from this, at least, to understand who we are without empires, and what can we do, what can we offer. And not discursively, but on the solidarity level, I think we can also join the Global South movements and social movements especially, and show solidarity with them. Especially right now, I think it's more critical and needed, given the fact that but imperialist ambitions are coming back, especially in our part of the world. So I think this is what we can do as academics, researchers, or civil society members.
To add to what Lala said also, one of the various decolonial thinkers, Madina Tolostanova, whose research we used, was very helpful to us. She's, for example, arguing for the need of not mechanically applying the post-colonial critique, which is basically born out of the Western European colonial context, but she is arguing for the need to understand the historically developed center-periphery relations in our region, and then think about how we should apply the decolonial and what do we mean under decolonial. So it's not just outside taking the theoretical framework of post-colonial critique and applying to the region, but actually trying to look at the local traditions, local histories, and the practices that have been either lost and dismissed by more Eurocentric forms of knowledge production, and then to think how we are approaching the decolonization process. And some interesting examples we found also among scholars from Central Asia. For example, there was author Nurullah Khojaeva, who is offering this philosophical tradition in Central Asia called Dakhles, which is a synthesis of both local philosophical tradition in Central Asia combined with external knowledge production coming from the outside. So this just one small example that I think there is, for example, just basically when we think about academia in our universities, we have no any basically local, let's say, philosophical essays, or like, for example, we don't have much of our readings on how do we even understand the international relations theory, the political science. It's basically just imported from the very Western academia, which is still very important, and we are all using this. But it's also very important to understand what would mean the local, let's say, understanding of the political science, international relations, and other many questions. For example, just to bring example, what do, like when we use the concepts such as development, progress, modernization, failed states, like we are basically reproducing these concepts, but without actually understanding how we are reproducing the meaning, which is informed by, again, this very Eurocentric understanding of what failed state means, what the development and progress means. So the colonial approach is very useful in terms of also our self-reflection, because one of the consequences of condition of coloniality is the internalization of this discourse of colonization, and only through the self-reflective approach, by trying to reveal the local knowledge production, I think this can be one of the way to think of how the local, within our context, decolonization can take place.
Thank you. Yes, indeed, very, very interesting discussions. But I think it's maybe already time to invite audience to join this conversation. We have already one question in the question and answer section from Bahruz, but I also invite others in the audience to submit your questions either to this section, to the chat, or if you would like to join orally our conversation, please raise your hand and join the conversation. Feel free to voice your question if you feel so. So the question from Bahruz is about Rasulzadeh. So Bahruz asking, was Rasulzadeh pan-Turkic at that period, 1918-1920, considering that he had Tatar Iranian roots?
Yeah, Tatrus. Yes, because I think he was already pan-Turkist, and to the latest period of his life, I think he develops kind of new idea of Turkism, and says that pan-Turkism was too romantic and not realized, but Turkism is something more tangible. It was at the later period of his life, in 30s or closer to 40s. And he thinks that Turkism is something when independent Turkic states can emerge, but it doesn't mean that they should be united in one big state. And earlier in the early stages, I think he was using nationalist pan-Turkist ideas to unite and mobilize the Muslim society of the Russian Empire, who were speaking Turkic, and they were also the most backwards, I think, part of the society. And yeah, he was seeing it as something very trendy also in the Europe at that period of time, as a mobilization of the people, of especially oppressed people, against the empire. And he was drawing the parallels with Slavic resistance and etc. But coming back again to your question, I think he was already pan-Turkic from that period.
Yes, Bahruz, would you let me try to let you? Yes, Bahruz, please unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes, indeed.
Yes.
Thank you, Lala and Diana, for your presentation. It's indeed very interesting. And it's really something like, it's a really great idea to bring the colonial theory into Caucasus. Surely it's been applied in Kazakhstani contexts, really that much. But yeah, my question is rather, when I read, for example, yeah, it might be weird, but Stalin and his national question, and, but I think it's a really important piece, and it's been written, he wrote it like before he came to power, before even Bolsheviks came to power, and there he mentions the question of autonomy, and he refers to Austrian Marxists or social democrats rather. For them, it's really important to give autonomy for nations. And Stalin here, he says that yes, it's understandable in a European context, but when it comes to Caucasus, and as a person who was raised in the Caucasian context, he says that yes, look at these people, look at the Tatars. They at their chassé kind of traditions, they beat themselves, or look at Abkhazian people, they have these traditions of killing each other, when like this family, how it's called, like enmity between families, or then he says like, and also I think he also exemplifies Armenians, and like it says that yes, but these people, they are not ready for such autonomy, or they are not if we will grant them autonomy, they will go and obey their begs, their khans, or their masters in this or other context. And how we can give them autonomy if they are not ready for this? They are not modernized enough. they live in this mindset that beyks, khans, they think that they represent them, like in other words. And of course, this argument goes against the colonial thought, I think. But how would you assume it? Like, let's say that let's imagine that the Soviet Union, the Bolsheviks, they didn't come to Caucasus, or they kind of they occupied. But okay, let's imagine decolonization of the Caucasus. How you like at that period of time in 20s, in 30s? Yes, we always say that Rasulzadeh and the Azerbaijani Democratic Republic, they give a voice to the woman, or the right to elect their representatives, but it never actually, like, it never happened. We all know that it was only in paper. And how you can imagine this process of decolonization, when the people were governed by beyks, by there was not even the sense of nation in, and there was a sense the people used to identify just as Muslims. And yeah, it's this decolonization thing. Overall, I respect this theory, of course, but I still can't imagine how it will work in reality. You can criticize the colonial ambition of the Soviet Union, or the Koreanization politics, or you can criticize its collectivization, or when they bring Russians from Russia to the Caucasus, or they created something that remind us European kind of colonization, so the Russian Poselki and stuff in Kazakhstan, or I think in other lands too. So the colonization is a theory, I understand that it criticized, but what it offers, I really still don't understand. But maybe you can answer to this question. But I understand Stalin's paper. I fully understand. I fully understand Stalin. Like, of course, it was before when he came to power, and I understand when he says that, okay, look at these people, they beat themselves to blood. How can you grant them autonomy? So yeah.
Diana, if I may start a bit.
Sure.
Thank you, Bahruz. It's a very interesting comment. So my position, we were discussing yesterday with Vadim and Diana, that it's exactly what Russian Federation, the discourse that they are employing right now, saying that, well, if Russia will go away from this region, look at these savage people, they will start to kill each other, in referring to the wars in our region, to Armenians and Azerbaijanis. Saying that, yeah, this Russia is the only guarantor of the stability in the region. But I think this is very civilizatory approach to the people, saying that, yeah, they are savages and we are better. We know how to deal with things, how to manage things, but they are not. They don't. And this is very problematic, in my opinion. We can, of course, dispute and discuss the Soviet legacy. And I think on the left, it's very discussed topic whether Soviet was empire, whether it was as bad as the Western empires, and whether it was an empire at all. It's a separate question to discuss it. But coming to your question about what the colonial theory offers, I think the colonial theory offers to see exactly the lines of oppression, how these empires oppressed, what kind of structures they built to oppress people. Because at least I think if we put aside the Soviet USSR and the Soviet Union, but discuss the Western empires, I think it's undisputable that the thing that they brought, it was very, very problematic, oppressive, and violent. And if, for example, a group of people, not calling them nation, you mentioned that some of them, in case of Azerbaijanis, we were called at least Muslims, but it doesn't grant anyone a right to come and oppress. I think that should be undisputable. Who were, for example, Europeans before? They were the same kind of savage people as Stalin is referring in his writings, in terms of the people to the Caucasus. But this was the same in regards to the Europeans, for example. But no one came and colonized, and it doesn't still give a right to others to come and bring their civilizatory mission to to other people. So I think the problem here is the civilizatory approach to others, to build the hierarchies of people, saying that some peoples are better educated than the others. I think it's all social construct. Some people had more opportunities to build education systems, etc., while others didn't have, especially because of the imperial past. So,
but it was admitted by the Soviet Union. They never denied that the role of Russian Empire as a colonizing empire, and they said that yes, it happened during the Russian Tsarist time, and now we change it, and now we bring education. For example, it's very obvious that families they would never allow their daughters to go to school because it's against the Islamic norms. And the education according to Islam should be only according to Quran, to Sunnah, and nothing about not Soviet style, but secular education. That, of course, it's obvious, right? And when the Soviet Union came, yes, it was done by force. And even my mother of my grandmother, she was talking how this protest was violent. They came to the village and they were checking the Azerbaijani Bolsheviks. They were coming and checking every place, every apartment, not apartment, but in village, it's like, let's say, household or something. Yeah, they were checking, yes, you have daughter, and now you should allow her to go to school. This process of modernization was violent, right? It's a violence. But how else you can deal with this? If you don't use violence inside, like you can modernize people, this kind of people, only by force, right? There is no other. When it comes to Europe, they were already modernized. Yes, they were colonizing first, and it's not about hierarchy, right? And but it was done by Azerbaijani Bolsheviks in Azerbaijan. They were doing it, but yeah, there was a hierarchy. I understand there's totalitarian system and so forth, but I don't understand what the colonizing approach offers to it. Like, what kind of alternative? How can you bring this modernization to these people? Like, what else you can do?
Yeah, I think this is what I see problematic in your view, is that you see some people inferior to others, and this is unfortunately something that I see and understand from your discourse. But again, that's what I mentioned earlier, that's why Soviet Union was a kind of exception, and it's very widely debated on the left and in the colonial literature as well, whether there are things that were good actually about Soviet Union. And I think I personally think that we should discuss Soviet Union in Soviet legacy, especially in that case. Of course, there were some things, very good things that all empires brought to us. Even we can discuss it in terms of British Empire as well. They built the roads, etc., etc. But we cannot neglect the violent aspect and the civilizatory and hierarchical element that they brought to this nation that they colonized. And we cannot, for example, neglect the Gulag system or the repressions of Stalin's and how many people were brutally killed under him. So I personally think that what the colonial analysis offer, it's exactly offered to bring this kind of violence to the discussion. Please, Diana, if you have something.
I just wanted to add that. So first, referring to Bahruz, that he was mentioning Stalin's notes on like superiority, or like looking through the civilizational lenses as one being more developed, that underdeveloped in comparison with others. Also, it's interesting that, for example, I would very much suggest to check the book of Alexander Etkind, which I found very fascinating, because he's exactly providing very, let's say, comprehensive understanding of Russian colonial practices in comparison with Western European practices. For example, already in 1907, 1917, there was a Russian Imperial Ministry of Internal Affairs already had the periodical called Vопросы колонизации, problems of colonization, that was exactly dealing with the settlement policies, land disputes, agrarian and other issues of the colonized people. And even interestingly, in 1828, Alexander Griboyedov offers a project to the Russian imperial authorities, which is based on the example of the settled colonial of British Empire in the United States. And he's saying that this settled colonial practice of the British Empire in the United States, in Northern America, is much closer to understand the Russian colonial policies rather than, for example, overseas policies of British Empire in India. And here his project was to resettle thousands of peasants from central Russia to Caucasus. But another interesting thing in the book is that you can see how some Russian military officers and their contribution, as well as Russian anthropologists' contribution, was very big in terms of reifying and essentializing the identities of the colonized people as less civilized, as someone who needs a patronage in order to reach some progress and modernization. And as I mentioned in the beginning, the mandate system was exactly, it is what it is. The mandate system was assigning the categories to different ex-colonized countries according to the level of civilization, saying that British Empire or be overseeing the process of development of nations until they are ready to self-determination. And so this is one of the aspects, is why when you say what decolonization can offer, the decolonization is exactly trying to understand critically the terminology that we are still continuing to use, and also to rethink the practices of the international legal system, which is still very much operating within the practices of the European colonial powers. So the same self-determination principle, or the same the way that international organizations are operating, the donor relations between international organizations and local NGOs. These are all very interestingly can be, let's say that the colonial theory can give an alternative understanding, not all encompassive for sure, but one of the alternative understandings of actually how we can rethink these relations and practices. And also regarding the Soviet Union, just a small notice that while definitely, and Lala also mentioned, and I agree that we are not dismissing, and I think this is definitely up to debate as how we should understand the Soviet Union, and for example, how we understand the cultural heritage of Azerbaijani people or Armenian people produced in Soviet times. Right, or how we think about the same heritage produced in imperial times. But it is one thing to have the cultural production, to have the certain right, but when the state is having the monopoly on violence, when the state is having the monopoly on political decision making and is neglecting the agency of local union republics, I think this is one of the issues that we can rethink actually what Soviet Union meant, for example, for the same Crimean Tatar people who were deported, or for the other groups, ethnic groups, who, although the political component and political ideology played a huge role in Soviet Union in terms of political oppression and violence, but we can also see how after the end of the Second World War, certain ethnic groups were specifically targeted again as a result of Stalinist politics. So I think this is all up to debate. Definitely, and this is what also Madina Tolostanova, that's why she's very much arguing and asking to understand the historically developed relations between center and periphery, and from understanding this, trying to build on a more meaningful decolonial dialogue in our region.
Wow, thanks a lot. Very important discussions, and I already see a lot of debates that waiting us in the future on this topic, and that's really great, actually, I think, for the region, and for not only for the South Caucasus, but for the so-called post-Soviet space. But yeah, actually, for some reason, yes, like we discussed different types of colonial structure, more like political structure of colonization, than cultural. But of course, I think in relation to this, it's not that it's not rather it's my small contribution to these discussions that we somehow dismiss the economic structure. Definitely in this, like this is what maybe made this difference between the Russian Empire colonialism and the Soviet well, that can be considered colonialism, colonialist approaches to the in the region. So yeah, of course, the capital structure was not that, and that what probably what makes Soviet colonization different from the European capitalist colonialist structures implemented in other regions. But of course, this are also question open for debates if you like to address that. But I think maybe we can take a related question to that. So the question from Mete: do you think the colonial relations in the South Caucasus, with regards to the to Ottoman Empire, Turkey, Russia Empire, USSR, Russian Federation, how they're different from European colonialism, or do you really see any difference in this? What are the significant differences that you can point out?
Yeah, briefly, I think again it was in Madina Tolstanova, she was referring that Russian and Ottoman Empire, they see themselves as inferior empires in comparison to the Western empires. So there was some kind of always need in the Russian and Turkey Ottoman Empire to stand up to the Western empires, to be at the same level or accepted to the club. And most of the time they experience this inferiority complex. And in terms of, for example, Russia, they even created, it's referred in the literature, they created their own Orient in the face of Caucasus and Central Asia, which was the Orient of the Russian Empire. And I think I wanted to mention something else, but I lost my thoughts. So maybe Diana, after you, I will.
Yeah. Thank you, Lala. I also wanted to say that this is really a very interesting question also, because one also of the reasons why we couldn't, well, first, when we were doing literature review, we realized that there is still ongoing debate whether Russia qualifies for colonial power. And there was the debate is related to the fact, again, that the conceptualization of the colonialism is still very much embedded within the Western European colonial context. While in case of Russia, some authors claim that Russia should be considered as a subaltern empire. So it is, if we consider its relations in the hierarchy of the relations with the Western European countries, Russia was always trying to catch up with the West, the same way as Ottoman Empire in the late 19th century, but it still does not dismiss the fact that these were colonial powers, although we have to approach them in a different context. And in case of Russian Empire, again, in the book, I think it was in Alexander Atkins, as I mentioned. There was an interesting quote from one Russian military officer, I think it was in late 19th century, who was comparing Russian colonial practices with British. And he was saying, in comparison with British Empire, where race was playing a very important role. So there was the policies of British Empire would be based on there was not so much intimacy between the subjects, so that would be non-white subjects, and between the British metropolitan, while in case of Russian Empire, we succeeded to do this by assimilationist policies. So this is a very interesting way that the Russian also authorities would be considering their own, let's say, how there would be spread the superiority, of knowledge and also the practices and also other forms of governance over the colonized people through the assimilationist policies, by giving them some, let's say, positions in the military rankings and also in the government governance of the empire, etc. So those are very interesting differences that definitely needs to be taken into consideration. But I think this should not obscure the discussions on Ottoman Empire or Russian Empire as being a colonial power or not. But another important thing also is that the Western discourse is, especially in 1918, 1920, I would like to mention this because it was very fascinating. When I was reading Hovhannes Kajaznuni, I realized that he was criticizing so harshly Ottoman Empire and its oppression against people, and the Russian Empire's oppression against people. Well, he was saying that, but you cannot compare this with British Empire because British was not treating Irish people the same way. So it was interesting that while he was criticizing these policies, but because again, the civilizational lenses was very important in the way they would I think Rasulzadeh, I'm not sure, but maybe Rasulzadeh also was having this kind of perception of the West. But in case of at least Armenian government officials in their writings, you definitely can see that, you know, this Western discourse on being the cradle of civilization was very much powerful already in 1980s, and also in some early writings of Georgian intellectuals, you would also see this, you know, kind of seeing the German, for example, empire as more enlightening as in comparison with Russian and Ottoman Empire, which does not mean that definitely the criticism is very valid, but it should be criticism addressed against all forms of imperial powers, not based on the civilizational differences as they would be assuming.
Thank you. Thank you for this contribution. Lala, do you have anything to add to that? Or we may take.
No, I think Diana covered it, so let's not take more.
All right, thanks. So I would maybe invite then Tamerlan to with his question to the room. Christina, who is assisting us technically, could you please? Tamerlan, please unmute yourself and raise your voice.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, sure.
So I want to go back to Bahru's question because I think this is rather central to our topic. And I know the topic of this webinar is rather specific, but I'm going to maybe be speaking more general terms. So the problem is, and this is where a lot of people who criticize the colonial theory gravely misses the point. The point isn't going back to a place or going back to a certain point in history. The point is, it is rather theoretical. The point isn't that we are going to discuss some technical details, who was assimilated, who was killed, but most importantly, what was the logic behind it that led this rather different political theories and ideologies like communism and liberalism and nationalism to somehow assert and execute same policies towards colonized peoples and even minorities inside central countries, core countries. And this is where most important point is raised, that the point is that they follow what Castoriadis calls certain logic of teleology, which is that expecting a certain end of history, or what's called the ideal city. These are very different but also similar concepts that needs their own discussion. But the point is, why we choose the colonial theory is to prove that as peoples, we also have potential of imaginary. We also have potential of radical imaginary. Like even Castoriadis, who was rather post-structural, who was rather in a way weirdly skeptic of universalism, but also Eurocentrist. Even he raised this point that if there is one thing that unites all peoples, it is this radical imagination. And the point is, with the colonial theory, is that we go back to the points of time where this clashes between what's called modernity and what's called quote-unquote non-modernity happened. This clashes between empires and subjugated peoples happened. And see the points where these policies led to our current political predicaments, let's say. Sorry about that. Yeah, so the point is that if we don't locate this exact policies that led us to our current situation, we cannot solve our current situation. Because again, I'm going to quote Castoriadis because I believe his theory is really, really important here. The point isn't what it is, but what it should be and what has to be. So for that, I believe we need the colonial theory, because the colonial theory isn't saying that this is authenticity, this is correct, this is not, this is just naturalistic fallacy. This is actually different from the colonial theory and has been disproven 120 years ago. This is naturalistic fallacy debates. It isn't that natural is better. It is that how we can escape this stranglehold of hegemony because somehow this hegemony and this system of heteronomy is raising up and somehow dominating all political systems, even though they are supposed to be alternative to each other. There is always a dominated and a dominator. There is always an oppressed and an oppressor. So the question is how it leads to that. Even though one is Marxist, the other is liberal, they have different economical policies, supposedly. They have different visions. So this is why I think the economic theory is really useful. And this is, I think this is an answer to Bartos's question, maybe.
Can I just very quickly, thank you very
Tamerlan.
much, Tamerlan. This was really a very, very great insight into the importance of the colonial theory. I also would like to add that exactly what to what Tamerlan mentioned, one of the problems is that there is a lack of political imagination of what the alternative would look like. We are basically just stuck within the current status quo, for example, inability to think the alternative to capitalist mode of production, or inability to think the alternative to nationalist form of thinking. So there is a very good book that I also would suggest, written by late David Graeber. It's called The Dawn of Everything, and I found it very enlightening and inspiring, exactly in trying to break through this, imposed structures of thinking and actually thinking what would alternative look like. And that's why the colonization is not just the critique of the existing forms of oppression and violence, but this is also trying to understand how they can be undone and what can be replaced it with, how the alternative can be brought. And I think this lack of political imagination is one of the biggest problems that we are having also in academia, and we are just operating with the same concepts and trying also to operating still within the same methodological nationalism, thinking the nation states and nations are the natural forms of like production, without thinking that actually, and also that was one of the reasons why we went back to 1980s, 1920s, is because we found so many different interesting peculiarities before the nation states were formed, which are again missing very much from today's understanding of what was happening in the past. So, for example, Lala found this from I think Firuz Kazemzadeh's book about how, for example, the establishment of borders, the checkpoints, was offended. A ridiculous thing. Today we think about the border as something absolutely necessarily. Border is something that, of course, there should be a border, and of course it's completely fine when the border officer is shooting the peasant or shooting the person who is by mistake is passing the border. There are so many shootings of shepherds on the borders, and of course no one is questioning that actually why this right of the state to implement this kind of violence because there is a border. While 100 century ago, when you look at the relations in the Caucasus, when just the borders were established, you see that the relationship of people with the land was completely different. And that's why I think like looking through these continuities is very interesting, and in the long-term perspective is very interesting, because it also shows us how these ideas are very not so much, they're not natural, they're not normal. This is just something that is brought by the consequences of the currency, but we have to think about how the alternative would look like as well.
Vadim, if I may very briefly, just to add to what Tamerlan said, I thank you, Tamerlan, for bringing this up as well. So I think it adds very nicely on what we were trying to say. And I agree that, for example, all this, the discrimination or the violence that currently migrants crisis that we are facing, or for example, the donors relations or international relations, or bringing this democratization wave to the post-Soviet region after the collapse of the Soviet Union, or it's, I think, the same continuation of this logic of bringing civilization to some people. And we cannot escape it unless we don't understand where the problem is and where the lines of oppression lie. And I think this is where the colonial analysis actually helps, because just using the class analysis or feminist analysis without bringing this differences in races or differences in nations or in religions. For example, seeing Muslims inferior. Without seeing this, I think we will still be in the trap of this violent cycles.
Thank you, Tamerlan, for this very good comment, and Diana and Lala for addressing it. I think it's time to conclude our session today, but I would like to conclude this with a question from that came from Laura Luciani. So she asks, what would be a decolonial peace project look like in the South Caucasus today? At what level of society do you see decolonial peace happening? Of course, when we're living in the conditions set by these conditions of colonialism set by the current nation states in the region. So do you see any possibility for this decolonial peace for the region? And how would you describe it? Briefly, if I may to ask
you. Should I go first? Okay. I think, yeah, there's a lot of things to be done in this regard, especially starting, I think, with the getting back our agency and decolonizing the donor or international organizations, folks, I don't know, the circles or relations, how to call it. I think a lot has to be done there. From my perspective, for a long time, the peace building and the peace activists, they couldn't realize their agency. The donor organizations were coming with their own agenda, with their own requirements, and basically setting it in the region. And the actors, the peace builders, they were just complying with this agenda. And what is actually needed on the ground, and what is the agency, what we want to do, was pretty much neglected, in my opinion. And this is, I think, something to work on, to decolonize this field. Also give more voices to grassroots, to people who really want to do something, and not see it only as a profession, but it also sees as an ideology or a thing that they're ready to fight for. I think this all comes with decolonization, because for a long time the NGO representatives or peace builders working in the NGO, they just become the part of the grant cycles, just receiving the waiting for the grants and not reflecting on their activities, why we are doing it. And I think this is something that we need to reflect, especially after the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, why peace building failed. Among all other political, of course, challenges that we have, the regimes that we have, of course, not neglecting it and not putting all the blame on peace builders, but the colonization, I think, should start, for me at least, from donor society. Yeah. Thank you.
And to what Lala said, I also think that the importance and success of decolonization, it cannot be just done within one country or two countries in the region, but especially I think it's very important to include people from the former colonial power, the countries that have been the former colonial powers. Like, I find very important to include also Russian researchers, academics, activists, Turkish academics, activists, and to think about this, basically the condition, how we can find an alternative way of cooperation, and to think about this, to organize a decolonial dialogue all together in the region, because as we both mentioned, this is not just interstate relations, but this is also rethinking our own societies from within, thinking the relationships that we have inside of our societies, and definitely organizing this. This should be a completely bottom-up approach, not state-sponsored, but we should just come together, find the spaces for enlarging the decolonial dialogue. And I very much hope that this will be not just being limited to the South Caucasus, but to the larger region. And just, I would, for example, be very much interested to talk to Central Asian colleagues, to Ukrainian, to Belarusian, to Russian, to basically everyone who feels that this is relevant to their experience. And that's why decolonization is a much more universal effort. This is not just limited within one limited country, but should be expanded to the larger regions.
Thank you, Lala. Thank you, Diana, for setting this great prospects for the future discussions in the region and beyond that, and not only discussions, but exactly forming these solidarity networks that would adhere to the idea of decolonization without all these misconceptions and mispractices set by nationalist groups, political groups, those in power, and those who are actually, while claiming to be decolonizing powers, in the end actually reproduce the colonialist structures in different formats and different dimensions. So thank you a lot for this great discussions. I'm very grateful to the audience with very interesting comments and questions. I think we will see new articles from these authors and maybe from others as well on the same topic, and we will continue these discussions also on the platform of the Caucasus edition. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vadim, for moderating.
Thank you, Vadim. Thank you,
you.
everyone.
Yes. Bye.